I thought, why not arrange a web lecture? And Shipra, they was very kind enough to agree to our invitation. So without further ado, I would now like to request Professor Mukherjee to deliver her lecture. Shipradi, please, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. Introductions are always a little embarrassing and always a little unreal. But thank you for that very kind introduction. I have kept my talk to the class format, since you are, as you asked me to, you are asking me to look into two texts which are prescribed in the syllabus. So I have tried to keep it as close as possible to the questions that you are likely to, that the students are likely to face in the examinations. This is the list that Aparna very kindly gave me when I asked her what kind of questions will the students be asked to answer. But questions, when put into the question format, they're always a little scary. So maybe we could just shorten them down to basically these themes which you students will be asked to discuss, will be asked to explore when the examination finally comes around. Okay, I will now minimize it. And I stop sharing. Right. So what we are dealing with today are two texts, both written by women, both texts that talk of the religious sphere, that talk of the secular sphere, both texts that move into the private and into the public sphere. The differences between the two texts as they handle these varied areas, spaces, is mostly one of degree. Now, the first obvious conclusion, therefore, that you come to when you read the texts, both the texts, is that these are texts where the religious and the secular overlap. These are texts where the private world and the public world, the home and the outside world overlap. But I would ask you to look at a little bit more closely and try to understand how they do not just overlap with each other, but how they very often move from one to the other. That is, very often you will find they use one area to move into the other area. So from the secular into the religious, or sometimes vice versa, from the private into the public, and sometimes vice versa there too. So these are the areas, and as we look at the private, public, as we look at the religious and the secular, we will be trying to understand how the notion of subjecthood, that is how a subject, how a person's identity, I, the I of Rashi Sundari Devi or the I of Pandita Ramabai, how this I, this person, this individual is being formed in 19th century colonial India. Okay, so these are largely the areas that we will be looking at. Now, though today we are taking up the two texts by Rashi Sundari Devi and by Pandita Ramabai, and therefore we are taking up two women's texts, you must remember that these are issues which haunted not just the women, but also the men of the 19th century. For example, if you look at the first drama in English, Indian English, the first drama written by an Indian in the English language was a person whom Pandita Ramabai mentions meeting when she comes to Calcutta. She speaks of, remember, Reverend Krishna Mohan Banerjee. And Reverend Krishna Mohan Banerjee's drama, The Persecuted, also shows us this kind of an overlap of a coming together of the private and the public, of questions sought to be understood, questions of the public world sought to be addressed in the private world, questions of the private world making their way into the public world. And therefore, right at the beginning, what you need to keep in your minds is not just that these areas, private, public, religious, secular, overlap with each other, but more importantly, the fact that they move from one to the other, that they are, therefore, as we say, not separable. You cannot treat them as distinct categories. And here, of course, you will be reminded of the very, very famous women's movement motto, that the personal is also the political, that the private and the public, that the personal and the political cannot really be treated as two separate arenas of power. Before we move into the exploration, a very, very brief overview of the two texts. The two writers, Rasha Sundari Devi's life is one that covers almost the entirety of the 19th century. Pandita Ramabai is born later, about half a century after Rasha Sundari Devi, 1858, and moves into the early first part of the 20th century. Both their writings are, in many ways, despite the similarities, also different in certain ways. That is, Rasha Sundari Devi's autobiography, Amar Jiban, has often been seen as the narrative of a docile, subservient woman who is obedient and accepts all the social strictures without complaining. Pandita Ramabai, on the other hand, has been seen as a figure of resistance, as a figure who has questioned, who has challenged the dicta of society, culminating in her conversion, her rejection of Hinduism and her conversion into Christianity. Now, despite these, then there are other differences also. Pandita Ramabai occupies a very, very urban milieu, right? She moves from one city to the other. She is mobile. She traverses throughout the length and breadth of India. Rasha Sundari Devi is, as it were, caught in one small village till she's 12, and then in another small village for the rest of her life. And therefore, there is also this rural, urban, educated, uneducated, in fact, at the beginning, literate, illiterate kind of a divide or difference between these two writings. However, if you look deeper, then you find that though Rasha Sundari Devi's writing seems to talk of obedience, acceptance, Rasha Sundari Devi is accepting definitely everything that society has heaped upon woman, but she is not doing that happily, right? So she does speak of how certain things are bad, about how just by chance it so happens that the man whom she marries is turned out to be a likable person. And therefore, there is that very, very clear indication that this man may have turned out to be a person whom she did not like. So liking, disliking, these words which talk to us of her own feelings, of her own agency, are present throughout the book. And then, of course, there are further issues which we will go into later. Now, before we move into the text, autobiographies became one of the very, very dominant genres in 19th century India. Most of the autobiographies emerged from Bengal and Maharashtra, and these became one of the very, very important genres, largely because they documented all that history could not. Okay, and here let me try to show you one book which I think is, one minute, I will have to first, I think, open the window, and then I do present now. I present a window, and yes, here it is, share. Okay, this is one book. This is a book by Uday Kumar, who writes, so he's speaking of the autobiographies that came from Kerala, writing the first person, literature, history, and autobiography in modern Kerala. And this is what Uday Kumar tells us about the first person narratives. practices of personal narration, he writes, indicate an important moment in the discursive history of the subject, understood here as the point where ideas of personhood, agency, and capacity for experience converge. So all the ideas of individual, the ideas of the person whose subjectivity is being formed, very often these ideas could not find a convenient narrative to enter the official history. In these cases, that narrative very often made their way into this other genre of literature, which was that of the autobiography, sometimes of the biography. Both biographies and autobiographies play a very, very important role in 19th century India. Stop sharing. The areas which are brought or which are foregrounded by the biography and the autobiography are, of course, those of subjecthood. And why really do autobiographies or biographies become such contested territory? It is because there is a certain political powers which are, so to say, or a political balance, more correctly, which are, so to say, threatened by the writing of the autobiography. The questions that are then foregrounded are questions like, who can write the autobiography? Who writes whose autobiography? Who can speak for another person? Why do these questions acquire a political significance? Because the narrator holds, dominates, controls, as it were, the ups and downs, the foregrounding and the backgrounding, the marginalization and the center staging of what is going to go into her or his narrative. Why does it matter whether you write a narrative or whether I write your story? It becomes important because then you can decide what is important and what is unimportant. And therefore, to the women, so when women begin to write their own autobiographies, women's autobiographies become far more momentous in significance, because for the first time, the voices of this unheard section of population can therefore be heard. As you see in Rashundari Devi's autobiography, the husband or marriage does not take up center stage. The husband is, as it were, pushed into the margins. He becomes a kind of a shadowy kind of a figure. Not just a shadowy kind of figure, but he becomes a kind of an instrument who unknowingly furthers the desire of Rashundari Devi to educate herself. So Rashundari Devi wants to read, right? Rashundari Devi wants to read. This is a desire or a thought that she holds in her mind. Now, the husband, who is supposedly the master of the house and the master of this woman's destiny, has no clue about this desire or about this plan or about these dreams that Rashundari Devi is having. Unknown to him, therefore, Rashundari Devi's project of self-education moves through her narrative. So one day when he accidentally says that here I keep the Chaitanya Bhagavat and tells his son, bring it to me after some time, Rashundari Devi sees in him, as it were, an instrument, not a controlling force, not a force with agency, but rather an instrument who is capable of furthering the desire, furthering the plan, the project that she holds dear to her heart. So in this way, a woman's narrative is possible to be made into a very, very different narrative from the narrative that patriarchal society would have written for her. Just 1 minute. Right. And so what happens is that when the woman writes the narrative, the background, what will move into the background, what will be pushed out into the margins, What are the important events of the woman's life? It is the woman who can then play a role or play the controlling, have the controlling hand in deciding upon this trajectory that her life narrative is going to take. It is because of this that women's narrative become so contested, that the fact that when women desire to write, or when women say that they will write, that there are so many heckles that are raised about the woman writing her narrative. And this is what Hilbrun says about the woman writing her own life. Women of accomplishment, in unconsciously writing their future lived lives, or more recently, in trying honestly to deal in written form with lived past lives, have had to confront power and control, because this has been declared as unwomanly. Why unwomanly? Women do not take control. Women are submissive. That is what femininity tells us is womanly. Women have been deprived of the narratives or the texts, the plots or examples by which they might assume power over, take control of their own lives. And it is because of this this political area within which a woman's narrative places itself, that the woman's narrative always arouses some degree of controversy in a patriarchal society. So much later, when Jyotirindra Thakur is writing the introduction to Rasa Sundari Devi's book, he tries to guard it. He tries to, as it were, barricade it within the home, to speak of this as a narrative that is written by a woman who has no knowledge of the outer world, and therefore very, very limited knowledge, so to say, a very, very ignorant woman, largely illiterate woman who has educated herself by her own efforts, and therefore a narrative that can only, as it were, go this far and no further. Right? So these are the political innuendos which are always present in a narrative. Now, because I mentioned the many male biographies and autobiographies also which were written at this time, I would like to point out one difference between them right at the beginning. No need to share this. Let me just read this out to you. This is Michael Madhusudhan Datta. Okay, this is Michael Madhusudhan Datta, 1842, writing of female education. Now, Michael Madhusudhan Datta in 1842 is only 17 years old. Okay, and in fact, this was a competition, and by writing this essay, Michael Madhusudhan Datta won the gold medal for that essay, and this is what he is writing. Many people have been unable to give up their belief in the existence of ghosts, notwithstanding the strong remonstrances of reason and the evidences of science, because the impressions left on the mind by the idle tales heard or recited in the nursery could not be effaced. It is needless to dwell upon the numerous benefits a child may derive from an educated nurse. In a country like India, where the nurseship generally devolves on the mother, the importance of educating the females is very great. For unless they are enlightened, they spread the infection of their ignorance in the minds of those they bring up. Extensive dissemination of knowledge amongst women is the surest way that leads a nation to civilization and refinement. Okay? Now, I am quoting from Shivaji Bandyopadhyay's essay. The essay is called Producing and Reproducing the New Woman, a note on the prefix re. And this is what Shivaji Bandyopadhyay says, that if nothing else, then the cocksure and inflexible tone of the essay is remarkable. It has the air of being written by a person utterly certain of his destiny. Michael speaks from a vantage point, sermonizes from the mount, as it were, with all the authority and a feeling of well-being derived from a stable subject position, a person who knows who he is, who is more or less sure what his identity is. It is only about a decade later that he is going to begin to question that identity and therefore the language that he should be using. The easy buoyancy with which he reels off the heavily loaded terms like reason, science, enlightened ignorance, knowledge, civilization, refinement, besides indicating self-assurance, gives a clue to the stuff and material out of which that selfhood has been wrought. So this is Shivaji Bandyopadhyay commenting on Michael Madhusudan's essay written about female education. But if you read many of the biographies, almost all the biographies and autobiographies, in fact, written in the 19th century by the males, you will find that these words, enlightenment, rationality, science, civilization, progress, all these words have a very, very, are scattered, so to say, throughout the books. Modernity, enlightenment, progressive thinking, all of these emerge as very important for the male subject in 19th century India. When you move into the female subject, though, especially the writings of the one that you read, Rasha Sundari Devi and Pandita Ramabai, we are surprised at the absence of these big words, if I may call them as such. In fact, Rasha Sundari Devi, when she talks of her desire to educate, does not talk of it's a motiveless kind of a desire. She does not give you any explanation. In some words, you may say that there is no caveat given on why she wants to study. She simply says, it is at this time, one day, that the idea to learn or the idea to want to learn to read entered my mind. She does not give you any explanation. Remember, this is the time when she is writing this. This is the time when in the metropolis of Calcutta, huge debates are being fought out about women's education. Should women be educated? And it is within that context that Michael is writing his essay, of course. And therefore, the need to educate a woman is anchored, or the discourse of education for women is anchored in the balances of motherhood, of domesticity, and therefore it also becomes a part of the Indian national discourse. So why should women be educated, Indian women be educated? Because it will make them better mothers, which is what Michael also says, right? Because it will make the domestic space free of superstition, free of ignorance. It will make it more enlightened. And that is the way in which our nation can move towards a greater, more progressive future, etc., etc., etc. And this is the discourse of civilization, which all of you have heard repeatedly in 19th century writing. In fact, Kailash Chandra Bose is also, let's see if I can find that. I had taken it down. Yes, this is the time when 1856, when Shushila Rupakhan is being written, right? And Kailash Chandra Bose is delivering the lecture on the education of Hindu females at a meeting of the Bethune Society. In this lecture, he argues that the wealthiest people of Bengal, who in his estimation were the best and the most intelligent as well, should rally around the hapless Hindu female, because, as he is arguing, only by releasing her from the clutches of ruthless and godless superstition could the nation be revitalized. So the need to educate the woman is not because the woman desires education, is not because, as Rasha Sundari Devi says, it had come into her head that she wanted to read something, but it is for the good of the nation, because in this way, the nation may be revitalized. In setting the agenda for the improvement of women's condition, the nucleus for every improvement in his opinion, Kailash Chandra Bose took recourse to not one, but 4 words. And as to be expected, each one of them was adorned by that ever-recurring and by now tedious prefix re. This is again from Shivaji Bandyopadhyay's essay. This is what Kailash Bose had said: she must be refined, reorganized, recast, regenerated. Okay, and Shivaji Bandyopadhyay talks of this as the native version of Macaulian harem. Okay, now perhaps surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, I will leave that to you students to decide, this echo of Macaulay's harem is not so much heard in the writings of Rasa Sundari Devi or in the writings of Pandita Ramabai. In fact, they do not appear to have arrived at this desire to learn through any Western education, through any European ideology. In fact, if you look at Rasa Sundari Devi, she is an individual who is as indigenous as a person can be. Now, of course, this is a statement that must always be made with qualifiers, because no space of history, no time of history can be entirely insular. And Rasa Sundari Devi also speaks of her childhood when there was a missionary school and her brothers would go to learn and she would sometimes sit and listen to them. But largely when we read her life, we feel this is one person who has not really been in touch with the metropolis, with the debates on women's education, with the influence of European education, and therefore her desire to educate herself can only be made as a bare statement, without any reason, without any motive being put forward, but just as a bare statement, as something that she wants to do. And it is significant, perhaps, that this statement of her desire is followed by her desire to read the Chaitanya Bhagavat. It is not something which is the other way around. It is not that she moves to religion, that she desires or moves to a religious text. Religion had always been one of the very, very anchoring, one of the sole anchoring pillars of her life. But it is not that she moves to religion, to the religious texts first, and then says that, okay, I want to read this text and therefore I need to become literate. Rather, it is the other way around. She tells you in her Amar Jiban that I want to educate myself. Just a minute, please excuse me. 1 minute. I'm sorry. It is as if after that bare statement that she makes about her wanting to, it entered my mind that I wanted to read, it is as if she needs some kind of a reason to put before the world, almost a justification. And she finds that justification in this religious text that she dreams about. Once she is into that religious text, once she dreams of that religious text, this is what she says. I haven't taken down those lines, but I'm sure all of you will remember that part where she is speaking of her dream, the dream that she has had, and about how she feels completely thrilled after that dream because she finds that this is something that she really can do. Similarly, just as Rasa Sundari Devi's desire to read is simply placed before you, as it were, on a bare platform, is Pandita Ramabai's self-exploration about her desire or her movement towards the texts. Remember when she goes to Keshav Chandra Sen's house and Keshav Babu asks her whether she has read the Vedas. And she says that she has not, because women should not read the Vedas. And she says that he did not answer, but he smiled and gave me some of the books. And then she says, this is what she is saying, I questioned myself, she says. Why should I not study the Vedas? Soon, I persuaded myself into the belief that it was not wrong for a woman to read the Vedas. So I began to read the Upanishad. And therefore, it is, even in the case of Pandita Ramabai, it is not her movement into education, her movement into reading these religious texts, not into education, she was educated earlier, but her movement into these religious texts does not use as anchors or as support any of the discursive strategies that are used by the males of colonized India. On the other hand, like Rashasundari Devi, both Rashasundari Devi and Pandita Ramabai take upon themselves, as it were, the responsibility of deciding to read the Vedas, of deciding that they will read the religious scriptures. Now, in this discussion, let me connect Rashasundari Devi's apparent docile nature, apparent obedient nature, to another female character who has had a long life in our legends, that is the character of the figure of Sita. In this book edited by Malashri Lal and Nomita Gokhale called In Search of Sita, Revisiting Mythology, there is an essay by Mondakranta Bose which speaks about this apparently docile nature of Sita. And Mondakranta Bose speaks about how this docile, this obedient nature appears to be somewhat hollow, largely hollow is what she argues. And she is not talking over here of the women's Ramayans. She's not talking of Chandrabhuti's Ramayans or of the other Ramayans which the women have written. She is talking of the Ramayans which were written by the male Ramayan writers. And she puts forward the instances of when Sita rejected Ram's suggestion that she should stay back at home and look after his aged parents when Ram was going to go into Bonavash. And the reason that Sita gives is that the scriptures tell me that the wife's place is always with the husband. And so it is almost ironical in the way she rejects what her husband says. She refuses to obey what her husband says by citing the scriptures which tell her that she should always be with her husband in order to do what she possibly wants to do, which is follow her husband into the Bonavash and not stay behind in the palace looking after his parents. So this, and there are other instances which Mondakranta Bose bring up, she says, point to the fact that this obedience or this acceptance are not possibly the correct words that we should use for these figures of the legends. And it is the same argument that one can make about Rashasundari Devi. Rashasundari Devi talks about how she hates, about this endless housework, which is painful, about how she has to keep on working, how sometimes she does not have the time to eat, how she has to go 2 days without any food because she cannot find the time to have any meal, how she is like a caged bird, how the only time when she had felt that her life was fun and enjoyable was the time when she was a child at her mother's place, when she believed that she was her mother's child. And therefore, Rashasundari Devi does accept what society has meted out to her, but she does not accept it happily. It is not that there are no complaints. Rather, and this is what Mondakranta Bose argues, that this is not acceptance. It is, on the other hand, possibly another way kind of thinking, which could be maybe more correctly called fatalism, that this is my fate. And that is what the writer Rashasundari Devi also says, that if this is the fate, the destiny that God has decreed for me, then there is no use, she says, in complaining about it. I have to just accept it. It is when we speak of acceptance, when we speak of obedience, therefore, there is in many ways an indication of a willed acceptance, a willed obedience. Acceptance and obedience also have a bit of the positive in them. However, when we speak of fatalism, when we speak of a person accepting one's fate, it becomes more an arena or a space where the person accepts the fate because the person can do no other. It is because the person realizes that the person does not have the power, does not have the agency to challenge that. And because the person cannot fight that, cannot change that, the person chooses to just let it be, not accept it, but let it be. That which she feels she can change, like education, Rashundari Devi does go forward into changing. This is what Rashundari Devi is saying. Girls did not read. How could I? What a peculiar situation I had placed myself in. What was I to do? This was one of the bad aspects of the old system. This was one of the bad aspects of the old system, therefore clearly indicating her awareness, her understanding of the fact that there is a change coming about, that they are in transition, and that there is something which is old and something which is different, which is coming about, which will be the new. The other aspects were not so bad, and so the other aspects were those aspects which she felt she could do with, she could put up with, she could tolerate. People used to despise women of learning. How unfortunate these women were, they said. They were no better than animals, etc., etc., etc. All right. Now, we find the same kind of what shall I say, an exploration taking place in the writing of Pandita Ramabai. Pandita Ramabai appears to us as a figure who, for the early part of her life, is not embedded within the familial structure that Rashundari Devi is. She is, therefore, as a consequence of a number of tragedies that befell her, a person who remains a solitary individual, and therefore more or less, as much as a woman of 19th century could be, possibly more, given that she was so spirited and so intelligent, a person who is largely independent. Yet, after her conversion, when she moves into the Anglican Church and she enters a relationship with Sister Geraldine, who is like a spiritual mother to her, if you remember, there we find Pandita Ramabai also refusing to accept, as she tells Sister Geraldine very clearly. Let me just read this to you. It is too much of a problem to share the screen, etc. Find it anyway. As she tells Sister Geraldine very clearly that I have just freed myself from the yoke of one religion. I am not going to take on the yoke of obedience to another religion so soon. And therefore, she moves from institutionalized religion, she moves from the priest's words of the Christian religion into her own space, where she says that I am going to interpret Christianity, the words of Jesus Christ, myself. Okay? So in Pandita Ramabai's writings also, we find this moving inward, in this coming into the private space. To go back to the point which brought me into all this, that is in the narratives of the males, we repeatedly come across the words of enlightenment, of progressive thinking, of the nation, nation-making, civilization, education, etc., ignorance, etc. When we move into the writings of Pandita Ramabai and into the writings of Rasha Sundari Devi, we find they do move into, especially Pandita Ramabai, who comes half a century after Rasha Sundari Devi, they do move into, she does move into this discourse to a certain extent, but she always moves into that discourse through her private understanding. She does not partake of the nation's discourse. She does not partake, and through that letter which she writes to Sister Geraldine, she does not partake of the institutionalized religion, Christianity's discourse either. She prefers to move into herself, looking within herself and trying to understand the reasons to move towards towards interpreting religious texts, towards education, towards educating other women, towards helping them establish themselves in society through her personal experiences. And it is here that the personal takes on such a powerful role in the writings of these two women. The fact that both their narratives, both their first-person narratives, appear to be written through the personal moving into the public, through the private moving into the political, rather than the other way round. In the male narratives, we often seem to move from the other way. It is because the nation needs us that we need to educate ourselves. Rather, for the women, you will find that this is the opposite way. It's the opposite way in which they seem to be moving. Now, this the fact that both Pandita Ramabai and Rasha Sundari Devi move into the writings of religion, move into the domain of religion, tell us something about their, just a minute. Tell us something about the possibility of empowerment that religion could hold out to women. Now, this appears to be a little contradictory in nature, because usually when we talk of religion, especially institutionalized religion, is almost always seen as something that is patriarchal. And these are the problems, they are the problems also which Pandita Ramabai begins to face. Rasha Sundari Devi, from 1800s, born half a century earlier, seems to touch upon the public world, but she does not really move into the public world. Pandita Ramabai, who chooses to move into the public world, does so in many ways using the strategy of religion. Now, religion becomes a kind of a support which enables Rasha Sundari to educate us, both Rasha Sundari and Pandita Ramabai, to educate themselves and therefore empower themselves. How does education empower Pandita Ramabai? When Pandita Ramabai, using her own, remember, there is this, sorry, I don't want to confuse you over here. There are three things we are really talking about, okay? One is the lived experience of these women. And I have been trying to explain to you how both these narratives take their discourse from their experiential learning, from their lived lives, not from religion, not from the national discourse, not from the discourse of modernity. So that is one part. We find both of them moving from their experiential discourses into the discourse of religion. It is almost as if Rasha Sundari Devi feels that now that she wants to read the Chaitanya Bhagavat, this is something that she is allowed to do. This is something which society will not question her upon. However, the logic to this is largely supplied by her own self. She dreams a dream and therefore moves into the Chaitanya Bhagavat. Similarly, for Pandita Ramabai, she is told nothing by Keshav Chandra Sen, who only smiles her hand and hands her the books. And then she says she persuades herself to move into religion because she thinks, yes, it is okay for a woman to read. So the movement into religion seems to be a strategic movement which both women do based upon their own experiential, personal, private discourses. Once they have moved into religion, however, they are occupying an area which is firmly embedded in tradition. They are occupying an area where the position of the woman has largely been accepted because tradition and womanhood have always been seen as being inseparable from each other. And therefore, when they move into religion, religion gives them, as it were, the tools to move into education, to empower themselves. And it is education which Pandita Ramabai uses when she begins to translate, when she begins to lecture, when she begins to write her books, which finally lead her into the material sphere, which will enable her to then set up the ashrams, the Mukti and the Sharada Sadhan, which she wants to set up. Remember Rasha Sundari Devi saying at one point of time in near despair, how am I going to write? How am I going to learn to read? If I want to learn to read, anybody who wants to read and write, they must have ink, they must have pen, they must have paper. These are words which awaken us to the materiality of this education sphere. That if you want to educate yourself, it is not something that you can do only through your spirit, your emotion, or your intelligence. You need to have certain physical things in your hand, and these physical things are palpable, material things which need to be bought in the society, in the market. And therefore, Rasha Sundari Devi takes the route of stealing one page a day from the Chaitanya book. Pandita Ramabai, who is able to move out into the larger public sphere, takes the route of lecturing publicly, of translating, and of writing her own books. So in this way, education enables Rasha Sundari Devi to a certain extent, Pandita Ramabai to a far larger extent, to move into the material public sphere, the economic sphere, so to say. Now, it is clear, however, that Rasha Sundari Devi also is not writing for her own self. Rasha Sundari Devi, when she says that now I'm going to tell you something about my children, you immediately realize that Rasha Sundari Devi then is not writing for her ghar. She is writing for the Bohir Mahul. She is, in fact, writing for strangers, because anybody who knows her will know exactly how many children she has, what kind of a house she has, what is the daily drudgery that she has to go through. So when she says, I am now going to tell you something about my children, you immediately realize that this text which she is authoring is in her mind already placed in that outer sphere, outside the Andur Mahal. For Pandita Ramabai, of course, it is a far more direct kind of a bridging that she does. And it is amazing because both Rasha Sundari Devi and Pandita Ramabai seem to believe in the importance of this private sphere, especially Amar Jivan, which talks entirely of the Ghar Grihasthali. It surprises us that this woman believed that it would be interesting to the reader to read that catalogue of daily household work that she would have to go through. The subject that she speaks of, her own individuality, her own person, the word individualism is not really correct, and therefore I would hesitate to use the word individual, because that has a larger Western discourse in the background. But when we look at Ashwasundari Devi as a person, maybe we could just call her a person, the subject, the subjectivity that she places in front of you upon the paper, there is this very unqualified assertion on her part that she believes what she is writing will be of interest to the people to whom, into whose hands this writing is going to fall. We are moving in now to the final question, which I'm hoping all of this will lead to, that is the way in which both these writers construct a kind of a tradition. Construct a tradition. If you listen to these two words, look at these two words, it seems to be somewhat contradictory. A tradition is something that has always been there, right? That is the meaning of tradition. When we speak of tradition, we are essentially talking of something that has been with us for ages to come. So when I say that the women writers of the 19th century are creating, constructing, crafting a new tradition, what am I really meaning by using these two words, which should, by all commonsensical ways of looking at it, be in contradiction with each other? New and tradition are not words that go together, right? And in this discussion, let me give you some other insight into some other writings. Are you being able to see Reimagining Traditions on the screen?
Yes, Shipradi, we can see it.
Okay. Now, when we read this book, a far later book, of course, by Hobsbawm and Ranger, The Invention of Tradition, Hobsbawm and Ranger talk to us about how traditions are invented. And they say that when we look at these traditions, which are created new, but which are given the name of tradition, a word that indicates that this practice or this new rite or ritual should be linked to something that is very, very old, we find that the pattern which is used to make these traditions was to use ancient materials to construct invented traditions of a new type for quite new purposes. There's a large store of such materials in the past of any society, and an elaborate language of symbolic practice and communication is always available to that society. So when we seek to create a new tradition, we do not really take an old tradition in the true meaning of the word tradition. What happens is a certain degree of falsehood, a certain degree of lie, a certain degree of the untruth is blended into this word so as to create a tradition that emerges in the modern contemporary space as something which is in reality new, but which speaks to us of something that we have been holding on to for generations earlier. The very word tradition, therefore, as it were, holds within itself the old and the new. And if you look at the different traditions that civilizations have formed from time immemorial, the making of Sunday as the holy day in Christianity harks back to the pre-Christian practice of worshipping the sun on this day, and therefore that day being holy from pre-Christian times. And therefore, when the new religion enters, it takes on a little of the old holy day, but it gives it a new name. If you read Romila Thapar's narrative of Somnath, you will find how the narrative which we hear of the Somnath temple is a very different narrative from the narrative which is there in the Middle East. Mahmud of Ghazni's attack on this temple has a very, very different story which is told in the Middle East, very different from our story. There, the name Somnath becomes the name Samna. Samna was the name of the pre-Islamic god. And therefore, this temple is seen not as a Hindu Somnath Shiva temple, but rather as a temple which Islam has always fought against. Similarly, when in the 19th century, Rashasundari Devi and Pandita Ramabai are creating a new tradition for womanhood, they are blending together the old and the new. This is another example which Romila Thapar gives us for imagined religious communities, where she talks of the name Hindu and about how the word Hindu itself has been changing from time to time to talk of different people, different kinds of people, always seeming to speak of the old Hindu, but in reality always talking of something new that has been injected into this earlier tradition that existed. The notion of a Hindu community, she writes, does not have as long an ancestry as is often presumed. Even in the normative texts of Brahmanism, the Dharmashastras, it is conceded that there were a variety of communities determined by location, occupation, caste, none of which were necessarily bound together by a common religious identity. The 19th century definition of the Hindu community sought its justification in early history using Mill's periodization, a British person, which assumes the existence of Hindu and Muslim communities earlier. Early history suggests the existence of multiple communities based on various identities. The need to create the idea of a single Hindu community appears to have been a concern of more recent times, which was sought to be justified by recourse to a particular construction of history. The new Hinduism, which is now sought to be projected as the religion of this community, is in many ways a departure from the earlier religious sects, and it seeks historicity for the incarnation of its deities, encourages the idea of a centrally sacred book, claims monotheism as significant to the worship of deity, acknowledges authority of the ecclesiastical organization, etc., etc., etc. Now, the reason why I move into all of these examples of how traditions are created, how traditions are made, is to show you the very strategic route that Rashasundari Devi, in her very, very within her, the Andar Mahal, and Pandita Ramabai in this larger Bohir Mahal, which overlaps with her Andar Mahal, is doing. The ideals of modernity, nation, education, civilization, enlightenment are ideals which are largely patriarchal in nature. Both women, therefore, steer clear of those ideas, preferring to dip into the ideas of religion, so that whenever Pandita Ramabai is questioned, you remember she speaks of her father, when her father was questioned about why he was educating his mother, how he could educate a woman, and that the Shastras forbade it. Pandita Ramabai speaks of her father not using rationality, not using modernity, enlightenment to argue, but rather going back to the scriptures in order to argue his point, and therefore proving through the scriptures, through the earlier traditions, therefore, that education for women was entirely acceptable. What is happening? It is almost like a kind of a tightrope walk, because on the one hand, they seek Pandita Ramabai and Rashasundari Devi seek to keep their Indian womanhood unchallenged. And at the same time, they are pushing the boundaries of Indian womanhood. This pushing the boundaries of the Indian womanhood, they choose to do through religion, because religion is something which at its core has remained very, very Indian. Even in the 19th century, when not just Pandita Ramabai, but even when the males like Krishna Mohan Banerjee converted to Christianity, they were accused of going against nationalism. And so Pandita Ramabai, like many other converts of this time, seem to balance these two demands cleverly by keeping the religion, Christianity, but by indigenizing it. Pandita Ramabai, for example, does not take on the Western European Latin Christian name which had been given to her. She keeps her name of Ramabai, just as was done by another person, Brahmobandhu Upadhyay. Brahmobandhu, who converted later, after, I think about 10 years later, after Pandita Ramabai, was given the name Theophilus. But he says, and he goes one step further and he says he's a Hindu Catholic. He will not take on the name Theophilus. And so he translates the name into Sanskrit, giving himself the name Brahmobandhu. Upadhyay, of course, is the title. Now, Pandita Ramabai, similarly, you find through her writing, keeps the Christian religion, but keeps the Christian religion by indigenizing it. And this is another discourse that is taking place through the 19th century of Christianity being indigenized, Christianity being taken away from the hands of the white-skinned foreigners to be made into an entirely Indian religion. Pandita Ramabai is doing this, Krishna Mohan Banerjee is doing this, Lal Bihari Dey is doing this. Many of these people are trying to find the roots of this religion in the traditional context of Indianness, which already exists as tradition in our country. Interestingly, therefore, and significantly, therefore, you find Pandita Ramabai talking of Saint Luke's Gospel. Remember, she picks up this book from the library, and she says what attracted her to this book is that the book talks of free will, okay, something which had been denied to her by Hinduism, because of which she feels the need to leave Hinduism and to move into Christianity. And it talks of the possible redemption of all sinners. If you remember, she had said of Hinduism that as a woman, like the Shudras, we are already fallen. We have no way. We cannot move into education. We cannot move into religion. And therefore, there is no redemption that is possible for us. So this is, therefore, one area where she could have taken recourse to the fatalism. But just as Rashasundari Devi chooses the areas where she is going to be fatalistic and those areas where she is not going to be fatalistic. So she is not fatalistic when confronted with the question of whether women should read or not. She decides to move forward through religion, because religion is seen very much as something which is within the Indian traditional domain. Similarly, Pandita Ramabai also decides not to be fatalistic in this area and therefore chooses to convert to Christianity. When Christianity, the priests of Christianity, try to talk to her about whether or not she should be educating young boys, about how far the women of the Mukti Shadun should be educated, she immediately puts up the barriers, retreating and saying that these are decisions. I'm not going to put myself under the yoke of yet another religion right away. I have just freed myself from one. And therefore, St. Luke's Gospel, which talks of free will and the possible redemption, attract her. And she moves into Christianity. Now, I want you to therefore think over here of the space of religion within which both these texts that are in your syllabus are so firmly placed. One, Rashasundari Devi's talking of her Amar Jiban, saying about how she came into education, how she made herself literate because she wanted to read this religious text, and about Pandita Ramabai, who is writing about Christianity and about the work that she is being able to do because of her new religion. I want you to think about the reasons which prompted these two women to move into this sphere. Was it entirely religious? Are they entirely sacred reasons? We usually think of the sacred and the secular as occupying two disparate spheres, right? We think of the sacred at one end of the pole and the secular, including all that is outside the sacred. Yet we find that the words which these two writers use are all words taken from the secular sphere. The concept of having a free will, freedom, the concept of having a future, the concept of wanting to read. Remember, Rashundari Devi does not start out by saying she wants to read a religious text. She says she wants to read, and then she has a dream where she's reading a religious text, and then she says, yes, why can't I read this religious text? In literature, we often talk about this colorful cloak that is thrown over events which cannot be presented directly. We often talk of them as, sometimes we say they are metaphors, sometimes we say they are myths, sometimes we may say they are dreams. And through these metaphors, myths, or dreams, we present before you, before the reader, those events which would be too harsh or too difficult to place before you in a straightforward manner. To give one example from the epics, it would be far too harsh upon the hero of an epic to talk about his wife killing herself. And therefore, we always talk of Sita's Patal Pravesh. We do not talk of her killing herself. Similarly, when we talk of the idea of Rashundari Devi moving into education, Rashundari Devi decides to say that she finally decides the point which finally clinches her decision to go into reading is the desire to read the book of Chaitanya. Now, these colorful cloaks, these subterfuges that we use, these disguises that we often use, chart out for us what you may call an oblique path. Both these women in the 19th century find their paths to freedom, find their paths to that end goal which they want to reach, covered by bushes and barbed wires and tangles. Now, when they find that, they cannot therefore move forward in a straightforward manner. What do you do then? You take a roundabout route, right? You take another route so as to arrive at your destination, but bypassing all these tangles and barbed wires and bushes that otherwise would threaten to block your way. And this is what Uday Kumar is writing in his book, First Person, writing the first person once again, that these are oblique pulsations of history in the timbre of the first person voice. Several dimensions of social individual life that do not find much room in scholarly histories of the period managed ample space in these personal narratives. Experiences of embodiment and social inhabitation, which relate a subject not only to the world, but also to one's own identity, found at times their strongest articulation in these first-person narratives. And these are therefore oblique writings, oblique ways. The sacred and the secular, therefore, as I'm trying to tell you, overlap because of this. Because sometimes the secular goals may be achieved through a sacred path. They take you to that sacred goal of achieving greater freedom for yourself in this sacred world. Sometimes, if I cannot pursue it through the path of the secular rights discourse or modernity discourse, then I take another path which is given to me by religion. In fact, this is also clear in Ram Mohan Roy's writings against Shoti. If you read Lata Mani's work on the contentious traditions here, this is what she's arguing. She's arguing that the women who were burned were marginal to the debate, and the controversy over sati was over definitions of Hindu tradition, the place of ritual in religious worship, the civilizing missions of colonialism and evangelism, and the proper role of the colonial state. Now, all of us know that the supposed trigger which pushed Ram Mohan into the debate about Shruti was a very personal one. But once into that debate, he chooses to take an oblique path to cross this grid. I think I more or less covered everything that I wanted to tell you. Let me just see if I have any more slides which I had wanted to show you. This is the choice. This is will be a familiar quotation, that there is a choice. And therefore, it's the new tradition, new identity, traditional identity within quotation marks, that these two writers are constructing in this through their writings. That gender is choice, that gender is a role, that gender is a construction that one puts on as one puts on clothes in the morning, and that there is a one who is prior to this gender, a one who goes to the wardrobe of gender and decides with deliberation which gender it will be today. Of course, this is a far later writing in Bodies That Matter. In the 19th century, this range of genders would not, of course, have been available or accessible to these two writers. And this is the tightrope walking that I was telling you. Ramabai is trying to balance this. She was caught between the missionaries who, as a rule, do not like the idea of my school being wholly secular, and the Orthodox Hindu who finds it repulsive to have me, who's a Christian outcast, for his daughter's teacher. But she needs to keep both, and therefore she chooses to be Christian by religion, but Indian by culture. Yes, I think that is more or less it. Thank you. If there are any questions, I will be very happy to take them on. I think I saw a number of them being put up on the...
Yes. Yes, Shipradi, there are a number of questions in the chat box. So,
will I read them out and...
I will read them out. I think that will be convenient.
Sure.
Will I read them out, Shipradi? Yes, sure.
Please do.
Okay, there are quite a few of them. Okay, this is from Shomik Shin. He is my departmental colleague. Shomik is asking, does the narrative space become a parallel reality or a reality that subverts the social space? Will you consider Rasha Sundari's devotionalism a political gesture?
Yeah, I'll take them one by one. Yes, Shomik, as I can see, this was in the early part of the lecture, and I think this is the point which I was trying to make towards in the second half of the lecture, that this devotionalism, okay, I will not say the devotionalism is a strategy, because I think that is far too presumptuous. But the devotionalism can work as a strategy. Strategy does work for Rasha Sundari Devi by making it possible for her to enter the world of education, to enter the world of literacy. Does the narrative space become a parallel reality or a reality that subverts the social space? I think these two understandings of these two spaces, one as a parallel space and one is a space that subverts the social reality, are really linked. If you think about it, they are not really two separate concepts. When Rashasundari Devi creates a parallel space where she talks about the drudgery, which is very much a reality for her, when she talks about her access to this religious text, she is in many ways trying to create a reality that will have an impact upon the reality which she is living through. And so it is a parallel reality, and it is also a reality through which she is trying in some way to subvert the reality which would otherwise have confined her to a very, very narrow space. Okay?
Ma'am, this is Shomik, ma'am. Am I audible to you?
Yes, Shomik.
Ma'am, I just wanted to make an observation. Don't you think that the self that seeks to make itself, it actually finds itself already affected and formed against its will by the social and discursive powers? And yet the agency and action are not necessarily nullified by its primary impingements. So I was basically thinking of this, that somehow or other the social space is affecting the narrative space, and in a way the narrative space was eventually constructing the social space. Can we consider this in this way?
Yes, I think that is what is happening, that the narrative literature does not remain in a space separate from the reality, from the real space. The two are
definitely not. Yeah.
In fact, when Rashasundari and Pandita Ramabai, if there is any difficulty in speaking in the real space, they will take access, they will move into the narrative space to make their points, which is what Rashasundari Devi is doing in her writing. So yes, most definitely the two are linked.
Aparna, you can ask other questions.
Okay, you have other question? Any other question?
No. Shipradi has already answered it. Yeah.
Okay.
Carry on. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is by Juhi Rai. She is asking, can we connect this to I Am Malala by Malala Yousafzai and Christina Lamb, in which Malala also stood for the education of women and was killed?
Yes, Malala is thankfully for us still alive, but she was definitely shot at. You may connect them, most definitely, because the writing of a woman's narrative has always provoked similar kind of a similar kind of outrage from Orthodox society. And it is because of that not just Malala's writings, but also the writings of Taslima Nasreen, Amar Maebala, etc., have always given rise to a lot of talk from the established writers. It is because the woman's voice threatens the established order. So in that way, yes, most definitely, you may connect the recent writings with these 19th century writings. Though I would like to say that there is one difference, and that is when Ramabai and Rashasundari are writing, the making of the Indian woman is a concept that is being created, that is being crafted. When Malala is writing, I'm sorry, I have not read Christina Lamb's, but or maybe you're saying that Christina Lamb is the one who maybe took down Malala's writings. I don't know that. But when we look into these modern writings, here, a lot of the support is coming from the concept of modernity. In 19th century India, support from modernity would not have been as easily possible for the Indian woman as the support from modernity is possible today. And it is possibly because of that both Rashasundari and Pandita Ramabai desire to seek modernity, freedom, through the aegis of religion. So that is one difference between the very recent books where modernity, individualism, liberalism are terms which women have access to today, because that tradition has been created over the past 2 centuries. Thank you. That's a good question. Yes.
Okay. The next question is by Mariam Khatun. She's asking, does Rashasundari Devi is not giving any explanation for her desire to read, emphasize that she succeeded to build the subjective self-I?
Not giving any explanation for her desire to read, emphasize that she succeeded in building the subjective self. Um, I would not go as so far as to use the word succeeded, because I think that despite the very unapologetic writing that Rashasundari Devi does, there is still a lot of barriers that she is evoking in her narrative. And the word success speaks of an ultimate reaching of a place which Rashasundari is still a little distance away from. But definitely, the fact that she does not give any explanation is a striking feature of her narrative. I would ask you to think over here of the fact that Rashasundari Devi is also hampered by the question of what explanation could she give. As she tells you very clearly, women were forbidden to study, women were forbidden to read, right? And therefore, there is really very little that she can give as a reason to allow her, enable her to move into education. So the dream which she has a few pages later, which sort of cement her decision to move into education, is a dream which does give a kind of a justification, which she had not given us earlier when she first says that she wants to read. Now remember that women were in the 19th century using these ideas of religion and religious tradition in various ways to carve out their position, their subjectivity, so to say, in society. If you remember the wife of Dwarokanath Thakur, when she comes to know that her husband has gone against the rules of commensality, that he eats and drinks with the mlecho, with the European, she calls the Pandits to her and she asks them to advise her on what route she should take in order to guard the purity of her own Hindu subjecthood. And the Pandits advise her that you are not to touch him, because by breaking these taboos, these religious taboos, he has polluted himself. So you are not to touch him. But because you are a Hindu wife, you have to continue to continue to take care of him in all the ways that you otherwise would have done. And that is what Dwarokanath's wife does for the rest of her life. So she remains this very, very orthodox Hindu wife, but obviously disapproving of the life that her husband was leading. So in many ways, women carved out their subjectivity, though we tend to think in terms of black and white, of women as being not independent and as women as being independent after the feminist movement. That is a far too simplistic kind of an equation to draw. And these two texts give you clues about that, about how the women within the Ondur Mahal were negotiating their subjectivities, their subjecthoods, and carving out a position for themselves. So Rashasundari Devi both gives and does not give a reason why she wants to move into education, why she wants to read. She does not give you any overarching reason for this decision of hers, but the decision is finally clinched by the fact that she wants to read a religious text. Okay, so it is a kind of a balance that she very carefully keeps in the book. Thank you for that question.
Okay, the next question is by Anindita Shen. She's asking, do you think these autobiographies come near the scope of testimonial writings of Latin America? Though socio-political context is different, do they have some similarity?
Yes, most definitely, the testimonio is a word that comes to mind when we read their writings. Rashi Sundari Devi, and especially, it seems to be writing this in a largely unconscious kind of a manner. A testimonio, the word testimonio is a word we usually use when it is written in a more or less conscious manner, right? So the taking away of the first person I and the use of the first person plural we to speak not just of me, but me as a representative of my community is usually in the Latin American testimonial somewhat conscious decision. We are not so certain about whether this was as conscious a decision in the case of Rashundari Devi, but the narrative that she finally writes, that she finally creates, is a narrative that speaks of a larger community of women who were invisible, unheard within the Andamon. The writing of Pandita Ramabai comes a little closer to that of the Latin American testimonial because she is talking of women who are destitute, women who have to be supported, women who need social support in order to move forward. However, both women talk of self-agency, and when they talk of self, both of them, you will find, talk of themselves as women, not as just as I, but as women. Even Rashi Sundari Devi is saying, is this my fate because I am a woman? So not just her own narrow sphere, but she recognizes that this is a fate, this is a sphere that is inhabited by many other women like her. So to an extent, definitely the testimonial is a genre that comes close to these autobiographies. Not entirely, definitely, because it is not as conscious a representation of a community writing. Yes.
Okay. Juhi Rai is asking, why women and Shudras were not allowed to read Vedas? I mean, that's a very direct question.
It's a very important question, Juhi. It is a question to which, firstly, it is a question the basis of which has been contested, right? Now, meaning that whether women and Shudras are really not allowed to read the Vedas, whether that statement can be made is also an area that has been contested. As you know, the women and Shudras not reading the Vedas is something that is ostensibly said to come from the books of Hinduism. Now, that quotation which I was showing you of from Romila Thapar's essay tells you about how Hinduism was never, possibly is never now, too, an institutionalized, homogeneous, monolithic religion. It was always a number of sects, a number of faiths, a number of religions, therefore. And it is because of that that Hinduism does not have one single book, which is the authoritative book, which talks about the entirety of the religion. If you go back to the many streams within Hinduism, you will find that they contradict with each other. And that is what Pandita Ramabai says, that the more I read the Dharma Shastras, I found that they contradicted with each other. That one said one thing and the other said that that was a sin. Why, if one held up something as being very holy, the other held that up as something as being very sinful. And it is because of this that we say that even if you're an atheist, it is possible for you to be a Hindu, because Hinduism was not an institutionalized religion. There were a number of streams of faith all over this land. Hinduism, as Romila Thapar goes on to say, was a geographical entity, talking of people who lived on this side of the river Sindhu or of the river Hindu, and therefore it had nothing or little to do with any kind of religious scripture. And therefore, it is not correct to say that women and Shudras were not allowed to read the Vedas. There are some books of Hinduism which say this, but there are some books of Hinduism which do not say this. The villain of the piece is largely seen as Manu, and it is Manu Smriti that is held up as the one book which speaks of, among a few other books also, which makes this kind of a statement. So this statement also has been contested. It is not, therefore, a statement that can be made at all. You can you can understand the political reasons behind this, of course, because why then has this reading of Hinduism that women and Shudras should not read the Vedas gained so much ground? It is because it enables the Brahminical patriarchy to hold on to their privileged position. And makes the others, allows them to keep the others in the margins. So it is a very a game of realpolitik that is being played when the women and Shudras are not allowed to read the Vedas.
Okay, the next question is by Pooja Hashda. If the pervading language in society is patriarchal, how is it possible to express and give voice to their lived experiences, and thereby pointing to the lacuna that lies in patriarchal society? How did they resolve the contradictions and showed an avenue that addresses these issues?
This is why I was speaking of these two narratives as traversing an oblique path. It becomes difficult to traverse a direct path, right? And because it becomes difficult to traverse a direct path in the patriarchal situation, the writers often choose an oblique path, trying to use other strategies which speak of a complicity while at the same time being subversive. And that is the reason why religion becomes so important in both the lives of Rashundari and Pandita Ramabai, because religion enables them to both move towards this alternative discourse which gives them a certain freedom, a certain dignity, while at the same time it does not threaten the patriarchal society so greatly as to have patriarchy come down upon them with a heavy hand and stop their work or their writing altogether. So this becomes a kind of a strategic way of negotiating with patriarchy, giving them something which appears to them as something which makes you complicit with their patriarchal system, but at the same time, it subverts the patriarchal system, enabling you to move forward with the agenda that you have. All right? I hope you have been able to answer your question. This is, in fact, what Ramabai and Rashundari are doing through their these two fragments which you have in your syllabus.
Okay.
Yes, please go
There's
ahead.
this question. Yeah. Priyanka Dubey is asking, Shudras in ancient India were not permitted to hear the Vedas, but the epics and Puranas were open to them. Why was there this demarcation?
We often tend to think of the past in a very, very homogeneous kind of a sphere. This is not how it was. It will therefore be untrue to say that the Shudras in ancient India were not permitted to hear the Vedas. If you look at ancient India, the entirety of this land, with all the inhabitants who were part of this sphere on this side of the river Indus, were seen as being people who could be labeled as Hindu. Now, if all of them were seen as Hindus, all of them to some extent had access to these Vedas. Now, when we use the word Hindu in this way, you must remember that the word is being used by an outsider who is coming from the other side of the Indus River, crossing the river and talking of these people all on this side of the river as people belonging to this land on this side of the river Sindhu. There is no religion here. It is a geographical connotation of an identity. A. B. When we speak of reading, writing, listening, we are thinking of these actions from a very, very modern perspective. Reading and writing were not all, to some communities, reading and writing was prohibited, but for a large part of our history, reading and writing were seen as largely irrelevant to the greater part of the community. This concept of literacy, this concept of literacy is tied up with the concept of modernity, which is a very, very recent phenomenon. If you go back to the 16th or the 17th century, listening to the Puranas or listening to the Vedas would have been quite enough, because it is not needed, it is not necessary for me to know how to read. It does not get me anywhere. The concept of reading as leading to literacy, as leading to enlightenment, as leading to greater empowerment, all of these are very, very modern understandings that have come down to us. So for a very large part of history all over the world, not just India, but for a very large part of the history, reading and writing were confined to certain groups for whom it was necessary to learn how to read and write. Okay? So we have the scribes in the Northeast, in Bengal. In fact, even if you look at the European literary history that you will be familiar with, for a very large part, all the people who knew reading and writing were people who were part of the clergy, were people who had moved into religion, because that is where learning began. Outside this boundary of the church, of the temple, of the masjid, reading and writing were seen as largely unnecessary skills. Nobody needed them. Even as I say this, however, it is true at the same time that strictures are written into many of the Hindu texts about how Shudras and women will be cursed, will be killed, should have hot molten lead poured into their ears if they forget reading, if they even hear the scriptures. This is the time from which the idea of education is beginning to be seen as a privileged sphere, as a sphere through which one can get a degree of empowerment. When empowerment, privilege is beginning to be associated with this idea of learning, with the idea of literacy and education, it is then that the sphere of education is beginning to be jealously guarded by the Brahminical patriarchy against the women and Shudras. And that is being done simply to keep the political power. And when I say political, I mean the word political in the larger meaning of the word, of the unequal balance of power that exists in every society, to keep the power within their hands. So it is a very uneven. There were times, if you look at the writings of Madhakranta Bose, whom I quoted today, if you look at their writings, you will find there were times when women read the scriptures, when Shudras, if you read Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's book, Jati, Borno, Samaj, I think, you will find him writing about many Shudras who did become rishis, muni rishis, because of Valmiki, because of their movement into education. So it is difficult, and it should not be. We should be very careful so as not to see the past of this religion, Hinduism, as a homogeneous sphere. It is not a homogeneous sphere. There have been contestations for power throughout this entire history that has been lived through in this land of South Asia. And those contestations of power tell us that there is no truth to the saying that women and Shudras should be kept out of education, should be kept out of books, should be kept out of the reading and writing. There is no truth to that. If some books speak for it, there are many books which speak against it. So it's a very uneven terrain with a number of streams of thought. People are debating, people are talking about it, because Hinduism was not and is not a religion that can be institutionalized and spoken of as being just one monolithic sphere. It is not that. So, I mean, this is a very, very large area, and I would encourage you to go into more reading. Very fascinating area, in fact, if you are interested. Okay. Any other questions?
The next two questions, I think Shipradi have already answered in some way or the other. They are related to what was asked earlier by Juhi Rai about the Shudras not being allowed to read the Vedas. So these have already been answered.
Yes, these are fascinating questions, and it is only right that you as students of English honors should move into these areas of reading. Religion is increasingly coming into our reality today as a dominant sphere of happening, as a happening sphere. And therefore, I would encourage you to read writers like Mondakranta Bose, like Shekhar Bandyopadhyay, who talks of caste, like Romila Thapar, who has contested this idea of Hinduism as it is being put forth today. Okay? All right. Anything else, Aparna?
That's it, Shipradi. So we will go into the valedictory. I think we have exhausted all the questions in the chat box, and thank you for so patiently answering all of them.
Thank you. Thank you, Aparna. It was a pleasure to meet the students. It was a pleasure to talk to you and to explore with you these two very, very fascinating autobiographies. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let me just end this session with a formal valedictory. Thank you, Shipradi, for your exceptionally brilliant exploration of the two texts by Rashasundari Devi and Pandita Ramabai Saraswati. Your discussion of the politics of autobiography was particularly interesting as it placed women's narratives within a rather contested political space. And your interpretation of both women's act of reading as something autonomous, which is self-guided and comparatively free of the 19th century discourse of modernity that underlined men's narratives, was extremely enlightening. Your reading of the possibility of religion as offering empowerment to women in the case of both these women, that is Rashasundari and Pandita Ramabai, the way you talked about the movement into religion as something strategic, which was triggered off by the lived experiences, and your tracing of the journey from the experiential reality to religion and to education was once again extremely insightful. You have identified their act of writing as a movement from the Ghar to Bahir, and your discussion of women's construction of tradition within both the Ondor Mahal and the Bahir Mahal by steering clear of the discourse of modernity and delving into religion as an alternative space within which the boundaries of Indian womanhood are both preserved and pushed struck me, and I guess to all of us here, as extremely significant and poignant. Uh, Thank you once again, Shipradi, for such a compact lecture which has touched upon all the possible aspects of negotiating with these two texts. I would like to thank my departmental colleagues, Dr. Shomik Sen, Dr. Bonini Mukherjee, and Parumita Bandyopadhyay for their support and cooperation in organizing this web lecture. Our principal, Dr. Sunil Kumar Biswas, the IQC coordinator of our college, Professor Shapun Kumar Giri, and last but not the least, our digital committee members, especially Shanu Dash and Shomin Ghosh, for their technical support. I thank all the participants for being patient and for being with us. Thank you once again. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you to the entire department, and thank you to the students especially.